Quick note before I begin, if you're just watching this for the tutorial and you don't want to listen to tangents and ramblings and stuff like that, just check the chapters, and each part labeled step, followed by a number, is the only content that you'll need to watch, and you can safely skip all the other chapters and stuff like that. Anyway, about a year ago, probably maybe a little more than that now, I repurposed a used Chromebook by installing a Linux distro Gallium on it, and later I ended up making a short video, basically just giving a rough kind of skeleton outline of how I installed a custom OS and provided some links to some more in-depth tutorials, and for whatever reason it kind of blew up, and usually that's great and all, but in this case there was some info that I neglected to mention, as well as some great info brought up by other people, so I thought I would quickly kind of redo the video and put in a little bit more effort and correct some stuff. Now, of course, the biggest reason why I'm doing this is because Gallium really isn't maintained. The last major release was in 2019, and it's kind of been on and off maintained since then, but it doesn't look like there's been much for updates since May of 2022, so I figured I would work on something new since the large video is largely focused on Gallium, as well as correct a few other little tidbits and stuff like that. Anyway, now with that out of the way, yes, you can actually install a custom operating system onto a Chromebook. There are, of course, a few reasons you might want to do it. First, of course, is that you get a lot more functionality out of a full-fledged operating system than you do out of a Chromebook. I remember the days when, a dual-core 2.x gigahertz processor and, 4 gig of RAM was decent for a laptop. And nowadays, you can probably find a used Chromebook with those specs for under about $40 if you look around for a good deal. Secondly, of course, you can avoid Google and other proprietary software. Now, of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, I get there's a bit of an irony on that, but regardless, it's still great to type up a document on LibreOffice instead of on Google Docs. And finally, this repurposes a perfectly good piece of hardware by installing an up-to-date operating system on a device that has long since lost Chromebook updates. Personally, I like having one set up like this because it's smaller than my regular laptop, making it super easy to transport around. It's got an extremely good battery life. Just the other day I got a notification that it was like, charged to 98%, 12 hours remaining of battery life, or something like that. And I know it probably wouldn't have lasted 12 hours. It was probably a little bit overestimated, but still, it's got a really good battery life. And of course, it's much less expensive if it gets damaged or stolen or something like that. Now personally, I generally speaking use mine for, typing up documents and stuff, streaming videos, watching pre-downloaded videos, general web browsing, and occasionally playing simple games, listed more or less from most frequent to least frequent. Now, of course, that's what I use mine for. You could have a completely different interest in setting up something like this, but regardless, it's still the same setup. Looking back to online college, I probably could have even gotten through it on a device like this, assuming that I expanded its storage in some way, so it's definitely very versatile for a lot of different stuff. Regardless, from here on, I'm going to list out the steps to perform this sort of setup. I'm just going to kind of lay out a framework of the steps, and I will leave a whole bunch of different links to resources in the description below. So hopefully it's easy to follow, even if you're not too familiar with it, and I don't do the best job explaining. Alright, so step 1. The first step is to just find a Chromebook. Now, of course, this assumes that you don't already have a Chromebook in hand that you want to do this with. In this case, obviously, you would skip this, but otherwise, the first step would be to buy one. Of course, buying one brand new would work, but if you want to get one for super cheap like I did, then used would probably be your best bet. Chromebooks don't seem to hold their value, at least when compared to other laptops and stuff, and I assume a large part of that is because it's somewhat harder to install a different operating system onto one, and they also seem to run out of updates fairly quickly, similar to cell phones or something like that. So you can definitely find plenty of devices for dirt cheap prices. eBay and other peer-to-peer markets are probably a good place to look. Just try and keep an eye out for ones with decent specs though. Most Chromebooks have specs that put it in the low to mid laptop range, which is perfect for a project like this. But if you find one with extremely low specs, then it would probably be best avoided. Either way, once you have a Chromebook in mind, begin to research it a bit before actually making the purchase. Which brings us to step 2, which is just researching the Chromebook. So at this point, you probably either have one in mind that you want to buy, or you already have one on hand, which means the next step is to look into what it's compatible with and what you can do with it. The first and the most important thing is to find out if the device will allow you to boot another operating system. Some devices come out of the box ready to boot to an operating system. A few devices don't support other operating systems at all, but most devices will probably allow you to boot to another operating system only after you modify the BIOS. Now, regardless of which operating system you're using, the best resource to check the availability to boot into another operating system on any given device would probably be the Gallium wiki. If the device you have or you're thinking about buying is listed there, go to the firmware section and see if a firmware update is required or not. If it says not supported, then the device probably won't work no matter what you do, and in most cases it'll probably say a firmware update is required, in which case you'll have to replace the BIOS. If the device is not listed on the wiki page, then you'll probably be stuck with a good old internet search, but the wiki page offers a great cheat sheet regardless of what you actually want to install. The second thing you'll want to research is the CPU architecture of the device. The manufacturer's website or the Gallium wiki page are both great places to check that. Now, of course, sometimes it can be a bit of a pain. For example, I purchased an HP 11 G4 Chromebook a while back, and its CPU architecture was listed as Intel Bay Trail, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out that yes, it was just a standard AMD 64. Now, most devices probably have an AMD 64 architecture, but you need to be sure in order to download the right version of any operating system, which we'll just discuss in a bit. And last, you may want to look into if replacing the hard drive or SSD is an option for the device. Chromebooks usually have pretty small storage, and if you're okay with that, then you can skip this step. But if you want more storage than comes with it, you'll probably need to take note of that and consider your options. Keep in mind that even if storage is replaceable on some models, it's easier to do on some than others. Anyway, regardless, I'll delve more into storage in step 3, which of course brings us to step 3. Like I just mentioned, obviously 15 to 30 gigs seems standard for most Chromebooks, which is a lot less than most computers. Now, that might be enough for you, and it was actually mostly enough for me in my case. But if you think you'll need more space, then you do have a few options. First of which, of course, is just to replace the hard drive or SSD. If the model supports it, of course, you can just upgrade the storage and pretty much have a truly full-fledged laptop with, low to middle specs for super cheap. That said, if the model you have doesn't support replacing the SSD or hard drive, and you need more storage than it has on it, then you do have 4 other options as well. Though of course it's not quite as ideal. You can always just install the operating system to a hard drive or a thumb drive connected via USB. You of course will need to keep it connected in order to run the operating system, but it's pretty easy to do and also might be your only option if you're using a device with a broken storage device that does not allow you to replace the storage device. Or of course if you want to continue to use Chrome OS on the main drive, but also want the option to boot into a different system on the same device without messing with the Chrome OS, then you can do this as well. Now of course just keep in mind that in order to do this you'll need to turn off Secure Boot, so you'll lose a security feature of Chrome OS if you intend to continue to use Chrome OS, but also boot to a different operating system on an external device using the same Chromebook. Secondly, and probably the easiest, you can always just use a thumb drive, SD card, or hard drive / SSD connected via USB as an external storage device. This way, of course, you install the main operating system like normal, but instead you just plug in the extra device and keep larger files and such on the external device. And of course, as a bonus, you can keep app images on the external device so you can install additional bigger software without eating up your limited space. See the resources if you're unfamiliar with app images. Third, which was really creative, was pointed out by AdamSinger77 in my previous video. If you install the operating system to internal storage, but then of course assuming that you're either on a Linux or BSD based operating system, you can then set the home partition of the user to the external storage device. Now of course, similar to installing an operating system onto an external device, you need to have the external device plugged in whenever you're using the profile on the external device, but if you don't mind a little extra configuration, you can use the external device for storage a lot more seamlessly than just plugging it in. and using it like a normal removable storage device. And last, of course, you can just expand your storage to cloud storage. There are a lot of cloud storage services, and many even allow you to mount your cloud storage like an external device. But of course, there are some limitations to expanding your storage with cloud services, such as, of course, requiring internet, potential privacy concerns, and potential monthly subscription costs. Alright, I guess that brings us to step 4, which is to replace the BIOS. For this step, I'll assume that you already have the device in hand now. Now, of course, if your device will boot into any system out of the box, then you can just skip this step. Regardless, however, in order to boot into another operating system on most Chromebook devices, you will need to jump through a few more minor hoops here. For this step, I'm going to refer you to DBTech's guide on installing Gallium. Regardless of which operating system you're using, you will need to modify the BIOS in the same way, and I believe his guide is a really easy to understand in-depth guide, which shows you how to install a custom set of BIOS and provides video of what he's doing along the way. So even if you've never heard of BIOS before, as long as you're up for a little bit of adventure, I'm sure you can get through this without too much trouble. And of course, again, the link is in the description. Alright, step 5 is just picking an operating system. Okay, so at this point, again, I'll assume that you have the device in hand, and also that you've replaced the hard drive or otherwise changed any storage options if you're going to do any of that. Now, of course, with that all set, your Chromebook is now pretty much any other laptop. And from here, if you know what you're doing, then it's time for you to pick your favorite operating system and continue from here. Now, of course, parts of this revision are based on information given to me in the comments, so I take it plenty of you guys know exactly what you're doing from here, and there's no need for me to try and advise you on which operating system to install. That said, if you found this looking into the topic, but don't otherwise have too much experience replacing the operating systems and such, then you have nearly limitless options, but I'll narrow it down to a handful that might be worth it for this specific situation. Now, of course, option 1 is Chromium OS, which effectively takes the open source parts of Chrome OS and builds upon that. It still requires a Google account, but it does sort of limit some of the telemetry and stuff like that, and according to the wiki, also kind of sandboxes Google a bit. Now, Chromium is lightweight and generally has the same security through simplicity as Chrome OS does, and does increase your privacy slightly compared to Chrome OS. However, of course, Chrome OS wouldn't provide a lot of the benefits that a full-fledged operating system would provide, and it still does require a Google login, so it's not completely Google-free. So in many ways, you're stuck with the same stuff a Chromebook would have, but it's worth mentioning since if you're only here because the device you're using is no longer being provided updates, then Chromium OS might be the best way to rejuvenate the device without actually needing to change too much. Next, another option would actually just be Windows. As much as I'm not a huge fan of Windows, I hate to admit it, but I still use it part of the time personally and all the time professionally, and even though it's not quite as private, and even though it's a little bit bloated in both storage space and processing power it requires, it will probably still work on a Chromebook. Well, at least Windows 10 probably will. I'm hearing Windows 11 doesn't support as much hardware, but that's a whole different can of worms, though in my opinion it wouldn't be ideal, especially for a project like this, where you'd be limited in both storage and processing power. But if it's what you think is best, or alternatively, if you need software only available on Windows, then it would be the best for you, and you could probably even get away without activating Windows or signing into a Microsoft account. Additionally, another option would be to use Gallium OS. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Gallium is a Linux-based operating system built specifically for Chromebooks, and aside from Chrome or Chromium, it is probably the only other system in which you can not have to worry about drivers and to expect custom buttons and stuff like that to work out of the box. Now, like I mentioned before, Gallium OS probably wouldn't be recommended since it's out of date at the time of writing. However, of course, if it does start to get maintained again in the future, or alternatively, if you plan on doing something that does not require the latest security updates, like, just composing documents offline or something like that, then it may still be an option. Last, and my personal preference here, is just to use a generic Linux distro. If you're new, or at least somewhat new to Linux and want to give it a try, my two personal recommendations to start out would generally be to use Debian or Linux Mint. Although I have a little experience with Fedora, and Pop! OS seems to be trendy, so this might also be worth looking into. Now, of course, Debian is just pretty simple, it's super stable and performs well, so that's what I went with here. Linux Mint, which is based on Ubuntu, which is based on Debian, is also a good choice, being designed to look somewhat similar to Windows, and is also probably a little bit more intuitive. TrustFM in the comments of my last video also mentioned previously that when he installed Linux Mint on his device, sound worked automatically, so I presume that it might have better driver support out of the box. Regardless of what you choose though, Linux distro would probably take up much less space and processing resources than would something like Windows, which is of course very important on a Chromebook, as well as the added benefits of increased privacy and the added ideological benefit of being open source. And now, finally, at step 6, once you have an operating system in mind, we can finally prepare to actually install the new operating system on the device. Now here I'm just going to provide a very generic overview on how to prepare installation media. However, of course, there are some exceptions. For example, if you're going to install Windows, follow their guide over the guide I'm going to give. And if you're going to use, say, a DVD instead of a thumb drive, write the ISO to the DVD instead of following the steps that I lay out. Regardless, however, here's a pretty just generic overview that'll work in most scenarios. Of course, check the resources for a little additional info. First, you're going to want to go to the website for the operating system you're going to end up installing and download the installation image specifically for the CPU architecture you determined the device was. Again, it'll most likely be AMD 64, but if it's not, then make sure to choose the correct one. Next, you'll want to download the Rufus tool corresponding with the OS you are currently working on. Unfortunately, you'll need a full-fledged operating system like Windows, Mac, or Linux, and of course, unfortunately, you can't do this from within Chrome OS. Again, I'll refer you to the resources section for a little bit of info on Rufus and stuff like that. Regardless, next, you'll need to get yourself a thumb drive that is bigger than the size of the ISO or image file that you downloaded, and make sure it has no important data on it whatsoever. You can now insert the thumb drive into the device and open up the Rufus tool. Once in Rufus, just select the ISO or image file you downloaded, select the thumb drive you inserted, and triple check to make sure that you have selected the correct device in order to avoid overwriting important files. You should now be able to just leave all the other settings as defaults, and if you're prompted to update Rufus or install additional utilities, then select yes and do so, then hit right and allow it to set up the thumb drive. At this point, you are officially ready to install the operating system, at least assuming that you got no errors or anything like that. Alright, so finally, step 7. Once you've completed everything else, the moment of truth comes and we can actually finally install the operating system onto the device. Assuming you're using a BIOS shown in dbtext tutorial, and also assuming that you installed the operating system installation image to a thumb drive, turn on the device, press Ctrl and G at the same time, press Escape once you get to the BIOS screen, and press the number corresponding to the thumb drive that shows up on the screen. You should now be greeted by the operating system of your choosing. Just continue to perform the installation. And a quick tip, if you find yourself stuck in the middle of the installation, if you just do a YouTube search of the installation for the specific operating system you chose, you will probably find tons of people going through the installation process in depth, which would hopefully be able to get you out of most jams you could end up getting stuck in. One thing that is important to address, however, is the lack of drivers. While this usually isn't an issue for run-of-the-mill hardware, when I was installing Debian on my device, I ran into an issue where I needed drivers that weren't bundled by default, likely of course because the hardware I'm using is probably less likely to be used than hardware in most modern laptops that come with full-fledged operating systems out of the box. Usually this would just involve downloading the drivers on a different computer and placing those on some form of removable media, like a thumb drive or something like that, then selecting those during the installation process. My quick fix for this, however, was to just connect my phone to Wi-Fi, then connect it via USB cable, and then set my phone to tether. That way the device received it as an Ethernet connection, which allowed me to continue with the installation and not have to worry about connecting to Wi-Fi. Regardless, however, just continue on with the installation, aiming to just get through the installation, regardless of if you have to configure drivers and stuff like that later. As long as you get through, just complete it, and once the device begins to reboot, remove the installation media, get to the BIOS screen, and tell it to boot, just tell it to boot from the hard disk instead. You should instead this time be greeted with the fully installed operating system that you've installed and can log in with the credentials you chose. Finally, we can move on to step 8, which is just the final configuration. And just a quick note, if this is the first time you're using Linux, I will leave a quick guide in the resources below. Now, regardless, with the device finally up and running, it's time to work on the final touch-ups and stuff like that. The first order of business is to check for updates and make sure everything is up to date. And if we're lucky, also download any drivers that are missing, but could be automatically installed. At this point, Chromium or Gallium would probably be set, since they would likely come packaged with the drivers required. And I guess to reluctantly give Windows credit where it's due, it would probably have pulled those drivers in an update. But if you're on Linux, then getting those drivers would likely be our first order of business. In order to get those drivers, the first thing is to check the manufacturer's website for the specific components in your device. So for example, if you're missing Wi-Fi drivers, find the radio card that came with the device, and then try and find the drivers that correspond with it. For example, going to your favorite search engine and just searching Intel Model 1 Wi-Fi card Debian drivers, and then in the case of say Debian, finding the wiki page for the drivers that correspond with that component. You may need to modify which repositories you install from, and then afterwards you can install the package. For example, the drivers I needed to install were in the Debian non-free repository, which I had to enable. Now don't worry about non-free. Free just refers to freedom, which means open source. Refer to the Linux guide for installation of packages, and refer to the link about installing from repositories like non-free in the resources section if you want help with that. Now, once drivers and such are taken care of, the last step would be just the normal process of getting a new computer or installing a new operating system. You know, just going through settings, installing software that you need, etc. But otherwise, you are set and ready to start using the device. Well, I guess that about sums it up. Hopefully, if you ended up going about doing this, you'll have completed it and everything will be working. And if you haven't done stuff like this too much in the past, then hopefully you've learned a bunch of cool stuff along the way and came out of it with a repurposed device that'll offer a lot of value. And of course, if you started with an outdated device, you have hopefully not only got it for dirt cheap, but also turned some e-waste into a usable modern device. Also, I hope this revamped guide was a lot more useful than the previous one I put out. Again, this is more so kind of a framework / outline of instructions rather than a true step-by-step guide, but hopefully with the resources listed below, it's enough to kind of look into and go from there if you get stuck at any point. Now, of course, if you run into any issues, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm kind of a moron, hence why I'm revising this guide to hopefully actually provide good information, but I will provide any information I can to hopefully get everything going.